Can somebody read for me Revelation chapter 8 and verse 13? Last verse of Revelation chapter 8, as we continue looking at these 7 trumpets.
And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the 3 angels, which are yet to sound.
So as we saw when we were looking through the trumpets leading up to here, that there's this division between the first 4 and the last 3. The first 4 trumpets have been played out, and as we've gone through them, we've seen that they are the judgment upon particularly the Western Roman Empire. And as the angel at the beginning of the chapter shows us, that the trumpets are the judgments that are coming in response to the prayers of God's people, for there to be justice done against those that have persecuted them. So it's the judgments upon Rome for its part in persecuting God's people. And that 4th angel, the sound of the 4th trumpet that we looked at last week, signaled the collapse and the complete fall of the Western Roman Empire. And now these next 3 trumpets have this specific message. Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth. Showing us that these judgments that are coming upon those that are persecuting God's people, these judgments are going to get more severe. These last 3 trumpets are these 3 woes. Now, we're going to read through the 5th trumpet in chapter 9, and we're going to come back and just go through it in pieces. Can somebody read for me Revelation chapter 9 and verses 1 through to 12?
And the 5th angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. But there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months, and their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man. And in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and shall flee from them. Death shall flee from them. And the shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle, and on their heads were as it were crowns like gold, and their faces were as the faces of men. And they had hair as the hair of women, and their teeth were as the teeth of lions. And they had breastplates, and it were breastplates of iron. And the sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots of many horses running to battle. And they had tails like unto scorpions, and they were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue has his name Apollyon. 1 woe is past, and behold, there come 2 woes more henceforth hereafter. And is that it?
Yes, thank you, Melanie.
Mm-hmm.
Now, just reading through that without getting into details, what are some of the first things that stand out to you in the contrast between this 5th trumpet as opposed to the first 4 that we've previously looked at?
Really detailed. and quite, I don't know, complicated. Like it's not simple. There's quite a lot going on. There's a lot of descriptions in here. So I don't know whether it's because God really wants us to know what's going on, or there's just a lot going on and he has a lot to say, to be able to describe everything that's going on so we can match it to history.
Petra.
So gone from mentioning thirds in judgments to mentioning specific people by their own choices.
And I think carrying along with both of that the amount of detail that's gone into this, that fifth angel is what we read there is 12 verses long. The entire of chapter 8 is only 13 verses. And the angels, the first angel only sounds in verse 7. So in verse 7 to 12, you've got the first 4, and this one trumpet has got more detail than the entire previous 4 put together. And so I think, like you're saying, there's more detail going into this. One of the things that stands out is sort of the severity of this judgment. It's that first woe as well. But that's another aspect to it. It details the sort of the judgment that's coming on under this trumpet. Now, in verse 1, chapter 9, verse 1, we're told that John saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth. Now, we saw a similar symbol back in verse 10 of chapter 8 for the third trumpet. Does anyone remember what were the things we looked at of what the symbol of the star represented? What are the things that comes to people's mind when we're talking about a star?
Angels?
Sorry, what was that?
No. Angels?
Angels, yes, yeah. Angels are a reference to stars. Gayleen?
We're told that later in Revelation that Christ is the bright and morning star, and then we're also told in, was it Isaiah or Ezekiel? Isaiah, that Lucifer is called the day star or the morning star. I know there were other things, but I can't remember them offhand.
Yep, yeah. So both Lucifer and Christ are referred to as stars. In Jude, it refers to false teachers and apostate leaders in the Christian church as wandering stars.
Yeah, that's why I think the punishment is so severe, because they knew what they were doing and they led others to be like them, which is why the Lord is so severe against them.
And we saw in Genesis, one of Joseph's dreams was of the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing down to him, and so that the heads of the tribes of Israel are also represented as stars. And we saw that stars have whether it's leaders in God's church, or Satan leading his angels, or Christ leading his, that these stars are leaders in whatever capacity they function. In Jude, the wandering stars are false leaders, apostate leaders. And so whatever this judgment coming under the fifth trumpet is, it has a significant leader at its head. Now, carrying on there in verse 1, we read that unto him was given the key to the bottomless pit. And I want to look at a few verses that deal with this bottomless pit. In Greek, the word is the abyss, abuso. Sometimes it's translated bottomless pit, sometimes it's just translated the deep. Now, if we can turn to Luke chapter 8, and in Luke chapter 8, there is a story where it appears, and depending on your translation, it might say the abyss, it might say the deep. But can someone read Luke chapter 8, verse 30 to 33?
And Jesus asked him, saying, What is thy name? And he said, Legion, because many devils were entered into him. And they besought him that he would not command them to go out into the deep. And there was there an herd of many swine feeding on the mountain. And they besought him that he would suffer them to enter into them. And he suffered them.
So there, what was these legions, that they're legions of devils that were possessing this man? What did they beg Christ for?
I'm sorry, what did they what?
What did they beg Christ for?
That they'd have somewhere to go. They had to be moved.
Yeah. Here it says that they didn't want to be, that he would not command them to go out into the deep. That word deep is that word abyss, the same word as this bottomless pit. Now, I don't want to get into too much detail about what exactly that means. I just want us to understand the context in which this is used. Okay, it's sort of that they're pleading for Christ not to be banished to this place called the abyss, the deep, the bottomless pit. Now, if we turn to Romans chapter 10. And can someone read verses 6 and 7?
Mine says, but faith's way of getting right with God says, don't say in your heart, who will go up to heaven to bring Christ down to earth? And don't say, who will go down to the place of the dead to bring Christ back to life again? In fact, it says, the message is very close at hand. It is on your lips and in your heart. And that message is the very message about faith that we preach.
Okay. Now, in your translation, it said that the place of the dead. That's how it translated there, a very dynamic translation. In this version, it's who shall descend into the deep.
Deep.
And that word deep, as your version translated place of the dead, is that same word, the abyss.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Also, another reading is the underworld.
And so here in Romans, that word's used to represent sort of the place of the dead. That death is a bottomless pit that can never be filled. The demons speak of this, beg not to be thrown out into the abyss, sort of this place of banishment of demonic spirits. Those are the two times this word is used outside the book of Revelation. So now we're going to jump into the book of Revelation and see how it's used within it. In Revelation 20, can somebody read verses 1 to 3.
Well, it says, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven with the key to the bottomless pit and a heavy chain in his hand. He seized the dragon, that old serpent, who is the devil, Satan, and bound him in chains for 1,000 years. The angel threw him into the bottomless pit, which he then shut and locked, so Satan could not deceive the nations any more until the 1,000 years were finished. Afterward, he must be released for a little while.
Hmm. So in this passage in Revelation, we haven't looked at this yet, but what is this speaking about? What do people understand? That what is this bottomless pit where Satan is shut up and locked away for 1,000 years?
He's unable to tempt anybody anymore.
Mm.
He's in jail virtually.
Mm-hmm.
You have to chain them, keep them away.
Yep, Galen.
That's metaphorical, though, isn't it?
Mm.
It's, I guess it's, he's put into a situation where he can't do what he likes to do. And given the fact that the Legion said that they didn't want to go there, it's not a place to be desired to go. So the fact that Satan is put somewhere where, if his angels didn't want to go there, he's not obviously going to want to go either, being the leader thereof. So he's put in a position where, or put in a place, position, or situation, whatever, that for 1,000 years he can't do what he normally does. We may consider it, he's been put in the naughty chair and told for 1,000 years to think about what you've done. But well, that's just how I see it. But yet the fact that he can't do what he normally does, because that he should not deceive the nations no more. That he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years be fulfilled. And then he's loosed a little while for a little season. So, yeah, I mean, deception is what he does. Christ calls him the father of lies. So that's the name of his game. I mean, nothing's changed. There's nothing new under the sun. He did it in heaven. He did it in Eden. He's still doing it today. So the fact that he can't do what comes naturally to him, he's not going to like that.
Mm.
Yeah, and that's the situation he's been put in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also it talks in Proverbs, I think I mentioned this before a few times, that the evil people are continually do evil even though they don't know why. And that not knowing why must disturb them, that they are encaptured with doing evil when they know what is right. And that's the same thing with what we're up against with the enemy here, with the different politicians or whatever, whoever's sold themselves to Satan and their loved ones. Some of them probably don't realize that, but now they probably do. They're so scared because they know who their master is and doesn't set well with them. So it's a tiring torment.
Mm. just one more thing to put this in context in Revelation 20. At the end of chapter 19, we see Christ coming back on the white horse, as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and slaying, people with the sword of his mouth. We have the second coming, the destruction of the wicked, and they're not resurrected until after that 1,000 years. So during this 1,000 years, Satan's left on earth with nothing but his demons. The reason he can't deceive anyone is because everyone else is dead, or the saints are in heaven and everyone else is dead. And so he's bound on this earth, and when that happens, it's called this bottomless pit. So the bottomless pit, in this sense, is sort of this, again, this prison where demons, where Satan and his demons are sort of chained up and are locked away in this prison. Now, if we turn to Revelation 11, and can somebody read for me Revelation 11, verse 7?
When they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them and shall overcome them and kill them.
Now, within the context of chapter 11, who are the people that this beast is killing and overcoming?
The wicked? Have been raised. No.
It says there in verse 3.
No.
3 and 4, it speaks of them.
No, the two witnesses.
Yeah, God's two witnesses are there. And these are people that are, the two witnesses are prophesying for God, and this beast ascends out of the bottomless pit and kills them. Now, again, when we get up to chapter 11, we'll go through this in detail and explain it. But just the simple idea is, whatever this beast is, it's not good. Okay, it's opposing God, it's killing God's witnesses, and the place that this beast comes from is the bottomless pit. And now if we can jump forward to Revelation 17. In Revelation 17, we see that there's this woman riding the beast, drunk with the blood of the saints. And we're given some details in verse 8, where it mentions this bottomless pit again. Can someone read Revelation 17, verse 8?
The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition, and they shall dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is.
So again, this speaks of the beast coming out of the bottomless pit. And without identifying it, just the simple question is what side is this beast on?
Not on God's side, against God.
And so jump back to Revelation 9 now. So we've looked at every time that word for the abyss, this bottomless pit of the deep, is used in the New Testament, to give us an idea that, he's this leader, this star, this fallen star, is given the key to this bottomless pit, and he opens it and the smoke ascends out. So the question we want to ask is, what does this bottomless pit mean or represent? So just going through these other usages of this word, what are some of the, not necessarily conclusions, but what are some of the ideas that are being brought in and used by John saying that he has the key to the bottomless pit and he's opening this up? What are we expecting to come out of this bottomless pit from the other places that we've read? Galen.
Well, considering that the devils don't want to go there, Satan ends up there, it always pertains to those who are against God, that are in the supernatural realm or the spiritual realm, I suppose one might say. So it sounds like it's Satan. I don't know, because we're told in other places about a star falling from heaven unto the earth. So it's a leader that's fallen from heaven. As you said, stars are often people or beings that are in a leadership role. So a leader that has fallen from heaven unto the earth only makes sense for it to be the enemy. But I don't know why he was given the key to that pit, or because the only thing that's coming out, the air was darkened, a great furnace and smoke. Whatever's coming out of it is of possibly a spiritual nature, as far as like the great controversy is concerned. It's not going to be a good thing. It's going to be a lot of darkness, a lot of woe. I don't understand why if it's the enemy that is the star, I don't understand why he was given the key, if this is in fact the way that it is.
Is it to do with the fact that that's his ultimate punishment, and he's given the key because that's his ultimate, that where he ultimately is going? That's his prison sentence, that's his jail, that's place of restraint, that's where he belongs, that's his home. I don't know.
Well, just sort of listening to what you're saying there, something that does come to mind, with both what Galen and you, Merlene, are saying. I just think in the Old Testament, when God's people had wandered away from him, and he sort of brought Babylon against them to destroy them. So he brought this pagan nation, with all their gods, but then he says that they will come to judge you, but then I will judge them and destroy them. So God used, I don't know if it's the right to say this, sort of the enemy's forces, but he used these pagan nations to do his will. And so here we've got the bottomless pit, this place of, you could say, spiritual wickedness. Okay, it's the holding place of demons. It's the, where this beast that's going to rise up and attack God's people and destroy is going to arise from. He's given this key to this, and this, whatever is going to ascend out of this, okay, it's spiritual wickedness that will be used to attack those that were persecuting God's people, as is the nature of all the trumpets. But in the end, it will have its own judgment. This power was given this key, but then in the end, Satan and all his forces are locked up and chained in this bottomless pit for the 1,000 years. Ralph.
Probably doesn't apply to Satan and the angels, but does it represent that they'll have a measure of control over it? that they'll prosper in what they do while they have the key,
Hmm.
something along those lines.
I think so. And if you jump down to verse 11 again, where it mentions the bottomless pit in Revelation 9:11, it talks about, and they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue his name's Apollyon. Both Abaddon and Apollyon mean the destroyer. So the king over this force
Satan.
is an angel whose name is the destroyer, the one that brings destruction. And so I think that is significant, that the angel of the bottomless pit, the angel of this pit of spiritual wickedness, is controlling this force and has a lot of influence in it.
In Revelation 20, verse 1, it says the angel came down from heaven having the key of the bottomless pit. So is that the same angel?
I would think not, because this angel is coming down from heaven. I would say that, this is a heavenly angel that's doing this, that's coming down from heaven, whereas in chapter 9, that angel of the bottomless pit, it doesn't belong to heaven, it belongs to the bottomless pit, if that makes sense. That's how I read that.
And the bottomless pit in chapter 20 is the earth, isn't it?
Yes, but
In chaos.
it's the earth at a point of time when it's being used as a holding cell for evil angels and demons, a dwelling place of demons. When the earth has God's people on it, it's not referred to as this abyss. When the Holy Spirit's still working here, it's not an abyss. It's only when all of God's influence and God's people are taken away and the earth is destroyed and inhabited solely by demons, that's when it's referred to as an abyss.
So it's desolate then.
Something interesting as well, when you look at the bottomless pit, I mentioned this, in chapter 11 and 17, it talks about the beast rising up out of the bottomless pit. It's just interesting that, we see three beasts in Revelation. The beast from the sea in Revelation 13:1, then in Revelation 13:11, there's the beast from the earth, and then you have the beast from the bottomless pit. These are all powers that Satan uses to persecute God's people and to attack God's truth. And they're all of them as something that's arising from beneath, whether from the sea, the earth, or this abyss. And so that's just an interesting, another interesting idea that this abyss is another place where from it arises those things that are opposed to God. So does someone want to read verse 2 and find out what happens when he opens up the bottomless pit?
Chapter
Revelation 9, verse 2.
9:2. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. Sounds like most people's idea of hell, doesn't it? Yeah.
Galen.
if the sun is darkened by reason of the smoke, there's no light. There's no light getting through. Yeah, and to me, that's God's word can't get through. It's being held back, or it's being smothered, or or however you want to word that. But the fact that the air itself was darkened, I don't know if air has any symbolic things in the Bible, but when there's smoke in the air, you can't breathe. And I'm wondering if the fact that the not being able to breathe, whether that be symbolic or literal or both, and the fact that there's no light, God's word can't get out. I'm guessing whether because it's being smothered with the smoke. That's all I've got. Sorry.
Yeah, or it can't be found anymore, maybe. No, you just can't find God's word.
I think what you're pointing out there, the fact that the air is darkened as well, points to the fact that this is a symbolic darkness that is spreading over, over this place where it's arising. It's not referring to a literal darkness, but it's a spiritual darkness. And we'll look at a couple of verses in the New Testament. In Romans 1 and verse 21. So the question is, what does the darkness mean in this verse? Romans 1:21.
The foolish hearts were darkened.
Interesting too that they knew God. These aren't people who don't know God, which means their darkness is actually something that they chose.
They don't have a connection with him.
Galen.
Reminds me of that verse, I've no idea where it is, where Jesus talks about the eye and how great the darkness is. And I don't know, and if it be dark, how great is that darkness? But that's what it reminds me of, and I thought it was something that Christ said. I'm not sure.
Yeah, do you want to read out Luke chapter 11, verse 34 and through to 36?
Is that where it is? Luke 11, 30.
34 to 36.
34 to 36?
Yeah.
The light of the body is the eye. Therefore, when thine eye is single, thy whole body also is full of light. And when thine eye is evil, thy body also is full of darkness. Take heed, therefore, that the light which is in thee be not darkness. If thy whole body, therefore, be full of light, having no part dark, the whole shall be full of light, as when the bright shining of a candle doth give thee light. Yes, that's the one I was thinking of. I had no idea where to find it. Thanks for that. But yeah, that was the verse, that was the passage that come to mind when it talks about that that they knew God, but their foolish heart was darkened. So they're foolish. So is the fact that they're foolish leads to their heart being darkened, or are they foolish because they're allowing their heart to be darkened? Don't know.
It talks about their foolish heart was darkened, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Or that's telling me that their heart was foolish before it was darkened,
Foolish hearts.
because they had to have a foolish heart before it could be darkened, just like God, had to have a son before he could send him. It's that same.
Well, if it's that simple, yeah, okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thanks.
Can we turn to Romans 11? And can I get someone to read out verse 9 and 10?
Hmm.
Mine says, likewise, David said, let their bountiful table become a snare, a trap that makes them think all is well. Let their blessings cause them to stumble, and let them get what they deserve. Let their eyes go blind so they cannot see, and let their backs be bent forever.
Hmm.
What version are you reading?
That's the New Living Translation.
Oh, okay.
I have the Greek and the Hebrew in footnotes, but it was interesting what you read in Romans 1. It says here on 121, it says, yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. Imagine that.
Hmm.
Hmm. And so we see in both these passages in Romans, darkness is used to represent a similar thing. Okay, the darkness is coming along and blinding the people to the truth, so they can't see the light of the truth. And it's happened because as a result of them rejecting the truth. They've turned away from the light, and so they're left to walk in darkness. You get that sort of imagery coming out here. Galen.
So it's the opposite. It's the opposite of Psalm 119, 105, which was a lamp unto my path and a light unto my feet, something to that effect. So the light and the lamp is being taken away. So we know that you can't measure darkness. The only way you can measure darkness is by an absence of light. So as the light fades, it just gets darker. That's the natural result.
Can we turn to Ephesians 4? And someone read verse 17 and 18.
This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart.
So again, that one, what's darkness representing? We see a sort of a theme emerging. through these passages of what the New Testament is used to represent darkness?
An absence of God
Mm.
in the heart, in the mind, in the life.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Lord, when he says, don't think it strange of our persecution. And I hear a lot of people at the rallies and protests or whatever, they say, I don't know how they can do this. It's so plain and obvious, the truth. And we need to look at it properly as the Lord said we should. And I think that's another reason why he says, don't look to the left or the right or behind you. God's wrath is going to take them all out, and we don't want to be consumed by that.
Mm. Did someone else have their hand up before? Is there a comment there? No. All right. Can we turn to Luke chapter 23? Luke chapter 23, and can someone read verse 44 through to 46?
And it was about the 6th hour, and there was a darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. And the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was rent in the middle. And then Jesus had cried with a loud voice. He said, Father, into thy hands I command my spirit. And having said thus, he gave up the ghost.
Hmm.
Darkness.
Hmm. Now this here is dealing with a literal darkness that occurred when Christ died, but I think it still has a spiritual significance. It matches up quite well that the sun was darkened in this time. And what does the darkness of the sun correspond with? Galen.
It would have been the fact that Christ was on his own. That he would have been experiencing the second death, which is separation from God, because he couldn't see through the tomb. He couldn't see past the tomb. So, and the fact is that there is, again, that separation from God, although this time it was by choice, because he chose to come here and to do this for us. And he was separated from his Father. And with the sun being darkened, we know is literal. And it could not have been an eclipse because it was full moon, because it was Passover. So a solar eclipse is impossible on a full moon. So yeah, it's still an absence of God or a separation from God.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So there was this darkness occurred when Christ was crucified. And I just find that another interesting thing when we parallel it with the other things we've looked at in both Romans and Ephesians, dealing with darkness and what that represents, and earlier in Luke as well. In all those cases, the darkness appeared when people rejected God. And here, when the Jewish nation, when humanity had rejected the Son of God, condemned him to death, having him nailed on the cross, that darkness appeared, that the sun was darkened at this as well, at this rejection of Christ as he was crucified and died. And so in every case that we've looked at, this darkness there's a literal sense or a symbolic sense is used to describe events dealing with the rejection of God, the rejection of Christ, the rejection of the truth, the turning away from the light and light. Now, jump back to Revelation 9.
A brief comment. It's interesting that the darkness always seems to be chosen. See, here even Jesus chose that. It was part of the package that he chose. The same as the light. It's something that's chosen.
Mm.
Mm.
And therefore there has to be judgment.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Here the smoke ascends out of the pit and darkens the sun and the air by reason of the smoke. Now, it talks about the smoke ascending like a great furnace. And there's only a couple of times in the scripture that I could read about smoke ascending like a great furnace. The first of those is in Genesis 19. And can someone read Genesis 19, verse 28?
And he looked towards Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and behold, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as smoke of a furnace.
So that God's the judgment and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the description of the aftermath of that, there's the smoke ascending up like a furnace. This destruction of God's judgment upon these cities. In Exodus 19, verse 18, can someone read that? We also have the description of smoke ascending like a furnace. And this is in a very different context.
Sorry, what was that reference again, please, Matthew? There's a bit of interference.
Exodus 19, verse 18.
Thanks. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly.
Now that appears in a very different context to what we looked at with Sodom and Gomorrah. So at the presence of God, when he came down to declare his law, the mountain smoked like a furnace at the presence of God. But also in Sodom and Gomorrah, where God judged them for their wickedness and their sin, the aftermath of the destruction was described as smoke ascending like a furnace. And so with this idea of the smoke ascending, it seems we've got two, you could say two options, two Old Testament precedents that we could refer to. It's either the judgment for the destruction following God's judgment, or the smoke at God's presence when he comes down to speak his law, to speak his judgments. And so we're going to look at a few other verses that deal with smoke, and then we've got to ask the question, which one of these actually applies to the trumpet in chapter 19. Now, there's a couple of other ones that will point to Mount Sinai. The hill smoked at his presence, a couple in Psalms. But can we turn to Deuteronomy chapter 29? Can someone read Deuteronomy 29 and verse 20?
And the Lord will not spare him, but then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against that man, and all the curses that are written in this book shall lie upon him, and the Lord shall blot out his name from under heaven.
So what does smoke mean there is the first question. What's that being used to represent? And secondly, who is this talking about? And we might have to go back to verse 19 to answer that second question. But firstly, what is smoke being used here to represent? Jaylene.
The ultimate consequence of the smoke is that the Lord shall blot his name out, shall blot out his name from under heaven. So it's a darkening again. It's a blotting. It's like God's version of using twink. Yeah, it's a darkening. Yeah, it's a covering up. It is a judgment, because eventually, and his name's not going to be in the book. So yeah.
Norm.
Matthew, mine on 20 says, the Lord will never pardon such people. Instead, his anger and jealousy will burn against them. All the curses written in this book will come down on them, and the Lord will erase their names from under heaven.
So your version is translated, his jealousy shall burn against them. And that's sort of the English idiom we would use. We speak of someone's jealousy or their anger burning, their rage burning. But in the Hebrew idiom here, it's mentions his jealousy shall smoke against him. So that they mean the same thing, but here it's that idea of smoke being used to represent what we would refer to as his jealousy burned against him. And there's some similarity, the connection between burning and smoke. Where there's smoke, there's fire. But I suppose the question is, you mentioned that God will never pardon such a person as this. What is the person it's talking about?
Sorry, what's the?
It says here, like in my one, God will not spare him. Okay, who is this person that it's talking about that God won't spare? You might have to read the verse previous to get the context of that verse 19.
Yeah, it says those who hear the warnings of this curse should not congratulate themselves, thinking, I am safe, even though I am following the desires of my own stubborn heart. This would lead to utter ruin. And I think that's the way the enemy is here. And the governor of Perth. We've been there for what, a couple months, standing in front of him. He should know.
Norm, your sound's just cut out.
Mm.
Okay, can you hear me?
You're very quiet, but
That's okay. Go ahead.
yep, we got you. Yeah, but as you're saying, it's this person who is saying they're going to walk in the imaginations of his own heart, and everything will be well with him. It sort of brings to mind what we were reading previously in Romans about those who became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And here the Lord will smoke against them in anger. So smoke is being used to represent God's anger and his judgment against those who apostatize, against those who turn away from him. Now, can we turn to Psalm 74? And can someone read verse 1 and 2?
O God, why hast thou cast us off forever? Why doth thine anger smoke against the sheep of thy pasture? Remember thy congregation, which thou hast purchased of old, the rod of thine inheritance, which thou hast redeemed, this Mount Zion, wherein thou hast dwelt. So was it just 1 and 2?
Yep.
Okay.
So again, smoke there is being used to represent the anger of God. In this case, it's burning against his people because of all the things that they have done. If we turn to 2 Samuel 22. And can someone read from verse 7 to 10? 2 Samuel verse 22. Sorry, 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 7 to 10.
In my distress, I called upon the Lord and cried to my God, and he did hear my voice out of his temple, and my cry did enter into his ears. And the earth shook and trembled. The foundations of heaven moved and shook, because he was wroth. Out of his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it.
So there, how is God, or what is God doing in that passage, and how is it described?
He's angry.
There went smoke out of his nostrils. That sort of is this picture of extreme anger, and sometimes you draw cartoons and steam's coming out of someone's ears. That's sort of our equivalent of showing how angry God is, but in the Hebrew idea, it was smoke coming out of his nostrils. And this is God moving, but it's not just him being angry at this, but that's him actually moving to judge and to destroy them. And as it carries on, it talks about he bowed down heaven and he came down and darkness was under his feet. And he comes down to judge the wicked and to deliver his people.
That imagery reminds me of where it says God is a consuming fire.
So in these last couple of passages we've looked at, smoke is used symbolically to represent God's judgment, his anger against a people, whether his own people or a foreign people, but his anger against those who have turned away or who are opposing him. And can we read in Joshua 8 verse 20? And this is our last one we'll read, and then we'll jump back. Joshua 8 verse 20 and 21.
And when the men of Ai looked behind them, they saw, and behold, the smoke of the city ascended up to heaven, and they had no power to flee this way or that way. And the people that fled to the wilderness turned back upon the pursuers. And when Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had taken the city, and that the smoke of the city ascended, then they turned again and slew the men of Ai.
So again, here, similar to the Sodom and Gomorrah, that the smoke ascending up is a symbol of the destruction that has come upon this. And similar passages speak of when Israel turned and destroyed the Benjamites. In Isaiah, it speaks of the destruction of the Philistines, or those in Palestine. The destruction shall come as a smoke from the north. The destruction of Edom in Isaiah 34, and the destruction of Nineveh in the book of Nahum. And so if we jump back to Revelation 9, so you see that this leader, this fallen star, has given the key to the bottomless pit, to this sort of storehouse of spiritual wickedness. And when he opens up, this smoke ascends, this destructive force, this judgment and destruction ascends, and it blocks out the light from the sun, bringing spiritual darkness with it. Now we've looked at these symbols, and so from this we get the idea that this leader will open up this sort of pit of spiritual darkness, and destruction, judgment, death will ascend. And as a result of that, the light of God's truth will be blocked out and darkness will reign. Now, one more thing that we might look at. Yeah, we'll turn back to Exodus, because in verse 3, we'll just start looking at this tonight and we'll finish it off next week. But in Revelation 9 verse 3, we read, and there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power as the scorpions of the earth have power. And so I just want to jump back to Exodus 10, and we're going to look at locusts where they appear there. Because these locusts, they come out of the smoke. In Exodus chapter 10, can somebody read Exodus 10, verse 4 through to 6?
Ten verse 4.
Yep, 10 verse 4 to 6.
Else, if thou refuse to let my people go, behold, tomorrow will I bring the locusts unto thy coasts, and they shall cover the face of the earth, that one cannot be able to see the earth, and they shall eat the residue of that which is escaped, which remaineth unto you from the hail, and shall eat every tree which groweth for you out of the field. And they shall fill thy houses, and the houses of all the servants, and the houses of all Egyptians, which neither thy fathers nor thy fathers' fathers have seen since the day that they were upon the earth unto this day. And he turned himself and looked out at Pharaoh.
This is one of the plagues of Egypt, and the plague is the plague of locusts. Now, in the fifth trumpet, we look at sort of the introduction bit there with the symbols of stars and darkness of the smoke of the bottomless pit, and that sort of gives us an introduction to understand what's happening. Pretty much the rest of that seal deals with these locusts, and it describes what they do and how they look. I just wanted to touch on this Old Testament reference here. I find it interesting that this is the plague of the locusts that comes upon Egypt, is one of God's judgments upon them. A couple of points that's interesting that we'll get into more next time. When these locusts come, God brings them by bringing a strong east wind, and we find that down, if we jump down in verse 12, God tells Moses to stretch up his hand, and then he brings these locusts upon Egypt. But he does it by causing a strong east wind there in verse 13, a strong east wind to blow, and it brings all the locusts in. So the locusts are brought in from the east, which if you go east from Egypt, you've got Arabia. And so that the locusts are dwelling in Arabia, and they're brought over, ascending up out of Arabia and brought over to bring this plague and this judgment upon the land of Egypt. And can somebody read verse 15? Exodus 10, verse 15.
For they covered the face of the whole earth, so that the land was darkened, and they did eat every herb of the land, and all the fruit of the trees which the hail had left. And there remained not any green thing in the trees, or in the herbs of the field, through all the land of Egypt.
So we see another thing there, that the next plague following is actually the plague of darkness. But here under the plague of locusts, the swarms of locusts that were brought in from Arabia were so massive they actually brought darkness. Okay, they actually sort of partially here blocked out the sun and brought darkness upon the lands because the swarms were so large.